Oh, interesting. So it's like only a doctoral.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think we
interesting.
were the first STS doctoral program in America, actually.
Oh, that's
correct.
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Somebody told me that when I was applying.
Yeah.
Where else has like an STS doctoral
Cornell.
program? Yeah.
MIT.
Well, they're not cool.
They're they a program?
They're history and anthropology of technology and science.
That's right.
And they're not. Yeah.
RPI,
Oh yeah, RPI. Yeah. And it's not. I mean, MIT is. I mean, my impression is that there's historians of science and there's anthropologists of science.
Yeah.
But it's not. And of course, STS is bound up in it, but it's not like
Yeah,
STS.
yeah.
You know.
Well,
Whatever
our
that
department's
means.
very varying on,
Yeah.
on
Whatever that.
question.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Do you know Daniel Breslau?
I'm not, hi. Yes, of course. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I was, did you see, some of this talk might be, some of this talk might be familiar from Edinburgh, but.
No, he's the one who first recommended that we bring
Okay,
you.
good.
So, yeah. Good. I talked it up. We talked it up good enough, I guess.
Okay.
Well, I sort of bullied all the grad students. I was
Good.
Like, if you don't come,
You're late.
I know.
basically.
Have you had a problem with events?
Yeah, well,
We've had a problem coming back from, obviously it's been forever, but coming back from COVID, of course, respecting people's different levels of comfort, but also just a kind of slouchy posture towards events.
well, there's some of that, but the other thing is that we never do social hangs like we're going to do tonight,
Oh,
so
cool.
everyone's real jazzed about
Oh,
it.
good. That's good. Yeah.
It was a fun excuse to do that.
Yeah, great. I'm excited.
Joe, how are we doing? Where are we at?
Oh, we're good. Whenever we're recording and streaming, and we're ready to unmute and Zoom whenever you guys are ready.
Okay.
All right. So, what about my slides? Like presenter view or how? What?
Oh, yeah. Oh, we didn't.
Yeah.
He just needs to change
Yeah.
the input. There we go.
That's what.
That's what everyone's seeing.
Okay. How can I do? I want to see my notes. Where's presenter view? Sometimes randomly the
Yeah.
use presenter view.
Cool.
Oh, perfect.
You good?
Yes. Yep. Exactly what I.
Okay. You got me? Everyone
No,
can hear me?
if you could unshare, yeah. There we go.
Oh, unshare.
No, you're not. Yeah. Start sharing when you start.
When you start talking.
Wanting to share.
Me.
Right now, we're gonna have Lee in the meeting.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Virginia Tech STS seminar. Are you good?
Oh, I'm good. I just
All
want to make
right.
sure I'm doing the right thing.
You're doing the right
Okay,
thing.
good.
man. You're so good. Welcome to this great event. I am Lee Vinsel. I'm an associate professor of science, technology, and society in the department, and I am one of the co-organizers of this event with Fernanda Rosa and Oliver Shuey, our trusty graduate student, as I like to say for some reason. I don't know why it comes to me, but that's what I like to say. Today we're really lucky to have Lana Swartz with us, who is an associate professor in media studies at University of Virginia. So she just came across the state with her family, and we're looking forward to hanging out. Lana does really interesting work about money and the intersection between money and communications technologies. She's the author of New Money, How Payment Became Social Media, and the co-editor at Paid, Tales of Dongles, Checks, and Other Money Stuff. And now she's starting to work on a book on scams, which is a great topic, and we're so glad to have you here. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. So I will just go ahead and launch into this. And can you see my slides if you need to? Yeah, okay, cool. So according to various reports in the popular media in the US, but also beyond, the years, every year for the last half decade or so have been called Year of the Scam. So 2016, Year of the Scam. 2018, Year of the Scam. 2019, Year of the Scam. 2020, highest year ever for scams. For some reason, the only year that I can't find some major outlet describing a year as Year of the Scam is 2017. So somehow 2017 was relatively unscamful, but nevertheless. Scams from catfishing to multi-level marketing schemes to sham cryptocurrencies abound on the social web. And some of the flashiest investment opportunities adjacent to the tech economy have turned out to be scams. Social media has proven to be fertile ground for both the cultivation of a world in which scams make sense and the diffusion of scams themselves. And we can't seem to get enough of scams, right? So some of the most popular fictional and non-fictional movies, shows, and podcasts are about them. And I will say I got into this topic a little bit before scams became like quite so big in the zeitgeist. So I keep trying to remind myself that scams becoming the subject of every podcast is only good for me because I'm not competing with podcasters. They're my primary, I'm studying them and studying this world. So, but my question really then is, what are we to make of this apparent scam age? So I'm going to use my time today to draw from my research on fintech, including payment systems, CBDCs, crypto, to reflect on various facets of the work that scams and the idea of scams do in the production of financial infrastructures, production of future themselves, and of markets, futures, and their infrastructures, put another way. So scholars from a variety of perspectives have pointed out that scams are a social construction, right? So the historian Stephen Mihm has described how in the 19th century United States, at its core, as he puts it, capitalism was little more than a confidence game or a scam, because as long as confidence was nourished, even the most far-fetched speculations can get off the ground, and wealth would increase. The same could be true of today. I theorize scams, therefore, as kind of capitalism out of place. And this is borrowed from, many have kind of used this construction, for example, to describe a weed as a plant out of place. The idea of scams is used to perform boundary work that delegitimizes certain forms of economic activity and certain forms of exploitation and legitimizes others. So scams are particularly important, I think, to understand now because the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate capitalism seem to be in flux. In part, this is due to a turn away from the traditional institutions of the capitalist economy and its twin, consumer protection, a turn that the transformation of money from crypto to the platform economy and other forms of fintech, which I've studied, are very much situated in and accelerating. Scams also fill and reveal unmet human need. Today, we are told, as part of this kind of acceleration of the delegitimization of existing institutions, we are told that everything from the college degree to the 9-to-5 job to the promise of retirement, the entire market democratic system is a scam, right? Everything is a scam. This may be true, but the claims are almost always an advertisement for something that is even more ambiguous, more multivalent, and in a word, scammy. So thus, scams identify what needs are being unmet, whether that's needs for identity, for some kind of social life, for some kind of agency, for some vision of the future, and offers a vision for it. So scams then not only fill the gaps, but take the shape of failing institutions. And then a key point here, which I'll return to, is that this same boundary work is being used to design literal infrastructures of the economy, to kind of terraform the economy of the future. So I also just want to say, and this is something I think is really important to keep talking about, and I sort of am trying to treat as a kind of methodology to my work, is that I want to keep thinking about the racial politics of the scam. So, the withering of institutions and the rise of the scam economy might seem like a crisis, but it is likely only understood that way because this structure of feeling has moved from the fringes, poor women, black and brown people, people in the global south, to the core of the white global north. There are many people for whom institutional promises have always felt hollow, for whom hustling was always a way to get by, and for whom respectability politics was always a risky strategy. So I think about LaShawn Harris's book, Sex Workers, Psychics, and Number Runners, Black Women in New York City's Underground Economy. I think about Jovan Scott Lewis's really interesting book, on repositioning Jamaican call center scams as a form of like economic reparation. So as the hustle, once racially coded, becomes more mainstream, I'm wrestling with how to understand its liberatory potential. So, you know, for Jovan Scott Lewis, scamming Jamaican folks who have been trained to work in call centers, using the call center infrastructure to scam, you know, wealthy elderly Americans, has this kind of like frisson of liberatory potential. And we see that in, you know, the crypto scams, in the like, you know, the way that scammers are sort of ambivalently lionized in our culture. But I think that, you know, in an age where mainstream white supremacist movements in the United States are like saliently marked as grift, like a whole book could be written on the scams and grift, you know, perpetrated by white supremacists and just the mainstream GOP. It's easy to see that this kind of scammy populism is far from inclusive. So I think that we have to kind of center this way of using scams to talk about power and privilege. When more people, white people, men, Americans, are not being served as institutions, that's when it starts to feel like an institutional collapse or crisis. So I want to keep trying to ask, and I don't know if I do it well all the time, but I think it bears noting that we want to ask how scammy institutions re-entrench whiteness, and how this work of categorizing and building infrastructure around scams serves existing power. So I'm going to talk today, after I kind of laid out some of my stakes and some of my interests here, and I'm going to talk about three things. And try to get at this scam question from three different angles: fintech, future, and Florida, which is where I'm from. Okay, so part one, fintech. As a starting question, and this one I think will resonate with a kind of STS department, is how do scams shape infrastructures of money, like the literal nitty-gritty of how money moves around? And you know, Lee referenced my book, New Money, which came out in 2020, and in some ways I am perhaps uniquely qualified to study scams, having spent the last decade studying cryptocurrency and payment systems. I've become an accidental expert on scams and to some extent their prevention and mitigation. In this book, I argue that money is, among other things, a communication medium, right? Money communicates value. I pay you $20, my account is debited and yours is credited, or you now have a $20 bill and I don't. But of course, these transactions don't happen telepathically. Instead, as anthropologist Bill Maurer points out, they are always enacted through media and infrastructures, which are always instantiations of meaning and power. So we often think about the politics of money as merely economic, right? Like who has money, who doesn't. But I think, and I argue, that a focus on money's most communicative modality, right, payment, allows us to see new meaning and new politics. And these are sort of like communication politics. Who gets to control and profit from communication infrastructure, from that movement of money and the things that allow it to move? What kinds of traffic gets to travel over it, and so on. So the history of payment then and its infrastructures bears traces of various ongoing conflicts between geography and speed, individual identity and collective accountability, private control, and the public interest. All of which I think are questions of infrastructure and questions of communication. The history of money technology itself tracks alongside other communication technologies. So print money follows the same stories we tell about print culture more generally. The newspaper shored up the nation state as what Benedict Anderson called an imagined community. Today, some of today's major payment companies like American Express or Wells Fargo started off not in finance, but in the mail, right? So like the American Express company is a train that competed with the federal post office to ship letters, checks, and gold across the expanding territory of the United States. The very same, well, I'll say, can I go back to that slide for a second? Does anybody know what this, and some of you, those of you who know, those of you, Lee can't say because I think he knows, but does anybody know what this third picture is? Any guesses? What do you see? What are some of its parts? We see a telephone. Yep. What else do we see? It looks kind of like a cash register. Yeah, we see a swiper for credit cards. Yeah, so this is an early point of sale system used to take credit cards essentially over a phone modem. So this is literally a modem with a card swiper and some, calculative tools built in. So, and I'm old enough as like a geriatric millennial, I'm old enough to remember where you couldn't swipe a card at a mom and pop store because someone was on the phone, right? So you had to hang up the phone, do it over the dial-up. And so too, there's like, you can still in some places, if you're lucky enough to not have young children and to be able to like go out, like hear like dial-up modem sounds coming from like ATMs in the back of certain sketchy bars. The point is that the very same technologies used to build the early internet were used to build the card networks. And of course, we know today that mobile phones, social media, and so on are kind of the site of innovation for our communicative world, including money. So the technologies of money track alongside the technologies of what we call communication more broadly. So too do the technologies of scamming. So, commerce, like any other form of communication, maps to communication channels, and so does its shadowy other scams, right? There have been new scams native to every new financial technology. Counterfeit paper notes, American Express traveler checks. Actually, American Express traveler checks it's a kind of main innovation, according to scholars of this, was that they were better at the U.S. postal money order system at fraud prevention, right? And that sort of is what gave them the edge. Early on, credit cards, there was a huge moral panic around new kinds of theft and credit cards. And as this kind of cult of the dead cow text file shows us, there are reasons for that, right? As soon as the internet became available, it became a vector of doing fraud, but also learning how and doing, information about how to do fraud. Scams are a fundamental aspect of technological change. Each innovation creates new opportunities for innovative exploitation. Scams work by kind of discovering and pushing up against the limits of technical, economic, and social systems. That's literally what they do. And in turn, scams, like all undesired behavior, shape the norms and rules of communication systems. So scam imaginaries shape everything about these money infrastructures. And these rules have institutional effects that have consequences far beyond the initial case they were meant to deal with. So as Tarleton Gillespie demonstrates in his book about platforms, in platforms, every traffic light is a tombstone, right? Every rule is evidence for the previous need for and lack of a rule. Scams then tell us something important about socio-technical vulnerabilities in the economy and in communication ecosystems. And so this is a drawing, a diagram from my book. And the artist who helped me make this went to Virginia Tech for undergrad. So, shout out to Megan Macera. But anyway, I'm not going to unpack this in too much detail, but I'll be happy to talk more about it in Q&A. But I'm using it to kind of make the case that it is important to note how the category of scams and this work of fraud prevention authorize surveillance and other forms of social control and communication power. So over the years of studying fintech, I've become obsessed with chargebacks. And what a chargeback is the process of a customer or card holder formally requesting and getting their money back from a card transaction. So, this is you got scammed, you want your money back. You have a product, the person who sold, you want to return that product, the person to whom you're trying to return that product, or customer or entity to whom you're trying to return that product doesn't want to give it to you. So as a last resort, usually, when the customer and merchant can't come to an agreement on refund or other recourse themselves, when the customer feels that they have been scammed, they go to their cardholder and ask them for a chargeback. And then their card their card issuer then goes to the network then goes to the merchant's bank. The merchant bank then tries to go collect from the merchant to kind of recoup that money. But it's part of the service provided by card issuers to kind of be the one holding the bag, be the one prepared to make the individual cardholder whole in case of being scammed. So in New Money, in my book, I describe how chargebacks, or rather the kind of imagined risk of chargebacks, structures almost all pricing in the credit card industry. Like the fact that the card issuer is the one holding the bag and then ultimately the card acquirer is holding the bag and has to claw the money back from their merchant, sets the price for everything and is, I would argue, one of the kind of primary decisioning factors in how the card network is designed and constructed and maintained. And I'm happy to kind of talk more about that. But it's also really interesting, I think, let me see where I am here. Okay, is that if merchants, like in this way that risk is parceled out in the payment industry, merchants who are classified as high risk for chargebacks, whether because they've actually had chargebacks or because they're in an industry or zip code that is considered risky, or for whatever other reason they've been labeled as risky according to received wisdom in the industry or analytics, they pay more to receive payments. So this is essentially a market for risk that enables these merchants to access the network. So, if you are considered risky for whatever reason as a merchant, you pay more to be paid. And some of these, risk determinations are based on some kind of data. Some of them are based on mere received wisdom. Some are regulation and so on. Some of these high-risk merchants are truly scammers, right? So, and chargeback fees have actually been used to choke off, as the kind of choke point terminology puts it, choke off scammers from payment infrastructure. But like all categorization work, there is power here and lots of ways to wind up on the wrong side of categorization. Pornography is an interesting case that I write about in the book. So porn is considered high risk for a couple of reasons. First, because of social stigma, right? Lots of people falsely claim to their spouse, parent, or employer that the charges for porn were done so fraudulently, and thus, right? And thus try to, so they claim that there's fraud, and then they go to their chargeback, or they go to their card issuer and try to issue a chargeback. And this second form of fraud, the kind of lying to your credit card company, is known in the industry as friendly fraud. So it's when you're willing to kind of like look the other way in order to maintain your relationship with the cardholder as a card issuer. But second, the porn industry is scammy, right? So there are lots of surprise recurring payments, like maybe you click a button thinking you're paying for porn once for $5, but turns out it's a $5 charge every single day, or suddenly you get a $500 charge 6 months later that's buried deep in your statement. There are lots of surprise recurring payments, lots of shady selling of user lists, and so on. And it's kind of important to kind of think about this because the card industry has shifted from one where there's a market for chargeback risk to a one-size-fits-all platform model that excludes all high-risk merchants, right? So instead of it being like, yes, you are a high-risk merchant, therefore you're going to partner with a high-risk card acquirer. Instead, more and more merchants are using platforms like Square or other payment platforms that are one-size-fits-all, where there isn't a market for this fraud. Instead, for this risk, all high-risk merchants are merely excluded, and if there are any chargebacks or if they're found to be kind of classified as scammy, they're merely kind of kicked off the platform. And this kind of platform model is really useful because it enables individuals who are not able to be assessed for risk. So like there is no way to assess in the traditional system me to see what my risk of chargebacks are. right? It's only a system that was developed for merchants and developed in an era where there was this kind of dyadic 20th century economy made up of merchants and consumers. So merchants who receive payments, consumers who make the payments. And so as this model is like overlaid with a new form of platform model, many platforms just have a straight up ban on pornography. So they have like a prohibition on the sale of adult materials, not necessarily because of prudishness, or misogyny, but because of the cost of chargeback risk. These risky transactions are just shunted off to specialized platforms. But that also means, and I write about this in the book, that anyone who winds up being categorized as risky can wind up losing access to payments altogether. So in the book, I explore this through the case of Eden Alexander, a pornography creator whose medical fundraiser was labeled pornographic and thus risky and thus prohibited when she retweeted a friend who offered a pornographic pic set to anyone who donated to her medical crowdfunding campaign. And there are countless examples of people suddenly losing access to their accounts to pay or be paid because they fell on the wrong side of this categorization game. And blocked users have no means of challenging the platform's assessment of themselves and their transactions. So one user I interviewed told me that of their experience with being banned from an online payment platform, that it was the worst of both worlds. It's like a bank with the customer service of Facebook. So any person who wants to get paid electronically is beholden to systems that are governed in ways that are inconsistently enforced, experimental, opaque, and offer little recourse for contestation. And it's this scam imaginary of the industry. It's via chargebacks that drives much of these decisions. And this case is from the US, but across the world, most mainstream electronic payment systems, there's kind of this slippage between disputes, scams, money laundering, know your customer regulation, all of which authorizes heightened surveillance and control, which is an issue for CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, which is something I've been doing research on and I'm happy to talk about, and might make the difference between whether a CBDC is a surveillance coin or something that looks more like digital cash, kind of a digital form of anti-surveillance payments. And so to return to the question, how do scams shape fintech? I suggest that scams create a paradox for fintech. Most of the time, people want to be able to transact without being scammed. But new payment technologies are fundamentally criminogenic. So at the same time, scams are supposed to be exceptional, and yet how much of the mundane infrastructure of our everyday transactional lives are shaped by them and shaped by the industrial imagination for them. And I kind of want to emphasize here, how is the future in the form of tomorrow's fintech being built during this scam age, being shaped by our kind of current scam imaginaries? Which brings me to part two, the future. How do scams shape the future? I argue, and as do many other money scholars such as Jane Geyer, Finn Brunton, that money is a form of future making. Right? We only accept money because we think it will be accepted by someone else tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And here in this section, I'm mostly drawing from my work on crypto, which I started in 2011, which makes me like really old in crypto years. But all crypto projects are shaped by futurity. They are at their core an attempt to summon an alternative future in the present. And they promise a range of possible futures. In some, cryptocurrencies are valuable because the blockchain systems they enable and entail have triumphed over their centralized and surveillance incumbents. In others, existing financial and governmental institutions have become so authoritarian or so incompetent, or both, that cryptocurrencies are necessary to sustain economic and communicative freedom. All of these visions are, on some level, imagining something that comes after like kind of liberal market democracy. But some of these currencies are also scam currencies, scam communities, scam futures. So, if crypto is at its core an attempt to build a future in which institutions, their paternalism, but also their safety nets are made obsolete by organizing collective activity beyond their purview. Then crypto promises freedom, including the freedom to scam and be scammed. And I've had numerous people in the kind of crypto world explain this to me, that getting scammed and being able to be scammed is a feature, not a bug for crypto. And that I've heard it described as a community where caveat emptor, buyer beware, is a value. So if we think of that as a defining ethos, then we sort of think about what future is being promised, right? Crypto is worth something now in the market, maybe, and maybe something in the future that is promised, right? So this kind of temporality where you're promising that this crypto, you're hodling for a future in which crypto is worth a lot, but you're maybe also selling it now, which is what keeps the line going up. And so this kind of temporality of crypto leads to scams like rug pools, where kind of the blockchain creators take the money and run, pump and dumps, where the trading value of the crypto coin is artificially driven up, and bag holders are left with nothing but a worthless token and maybe a shattered dream. So again and again in crypto, the blockchain dream of a radically decentralized future is deferred to a yet more distant future. But some people make a lot of money in the now, perpetuating the hype that drives interest in blockchain in the first place. And I've written a bit about ICOs, which are basically a kind of cryptocurrency crowdfunding attempt where you mint a bunch of coins, you sell them off, and you say that you're going to use that money to build a system of some kind. But then, and then you either do a rug pull, take the money and run, or you inflate your coin, sell it off, and then take that money and run. Many, at the height of the kind of ICO boom, people were, writing fake white papers getting fake white papers written on Fiverr. I'm sure now ChatGPT is even more efficient at making fake white papers. People are stealing, information from LinkedIn to make like fake leadership teams. It was a whole world of just kind of like Potemkin crypto coins. So crypto then could be seen as a frenzy to bring about a future driven by a collective that doesn't actually really believe that that future is going to ever come. And so, again, when I talk to people in crypto, they always tell me to beware of everybody else I'm talking to or interviewing or reading, right? They say to me things like, the thing you have to understand is that you can't trust anything anyone else says because everyone is just pumping their bags. Everyone is trying to drive up the value of their own crypto investment. But in this context, pumping your bags is indistinguishable from promoting your vision for a better world. A true believer is indistinguishable from a shill. And on the other hand, a shill is indistinguishable from a rational actor, right? Someone who is trying, maybe desperately, to protect their investment, perhaps even their life savings. Once you've bought in, you have to keep believing and perpetuating belief in order to protect your own position. Everyone tells everyone else to hodl, right? To hold on, to not sell. But nobody wants to be left holding the bag. No one wants to be the last one left who still believes in the crypto dream. Crypto scams then are ambivalent, but therein lies a kind of frisson, a kind of like collective effervescence that makes ambivalent belief in the future and thus action even possible. So I love this. Dave Portnoy, he straight up announced his shitcoin announcement. He says, invest in your own risk. I have no idea how this works. And in a similar communication, he says, if it's a Ponzi, get in early. So in the popular imagination, as well as academic literature, what all of this is, one of the reasons why all of this is kind of interesting to me, kind of from a theoretical level, is that in the kind of academic literature and popular imagination, scams are always seen as individualistic, right? A confidence game is imagined as a game with two players, right? The con artist and the mark. The crypto scams and the other scams adjacent scams I see emerging in the digital economy right now are better understood, I think, to kind of maintain this game metaphor as part of a massively multiplayer online game, right? There are no clear scammers. There are no clear marks. Everybody is everything all at once. It's a scam where these scams are decentralized without a clear set of perpetrators and victims, a kind of networked scam, right? A kind of shadow multitude that are self-organized but without social contract. And kind of beyond crypto, and this is really, I would say, the kind of topic of my current book project, which I would love to talk with you all more about, is that the digital economy seems to be fertile ground for other similar kind of networked scam formations. These network activities organized via social media, oops, what's going on? Where's my cursor? It went away. Anyway, whoa. They heard me. They heard me.
Yeah.
They know. All right. All right, I guess I'll just go. I don't want you to know about Florida yet. From current slide. Okay, bam, okay. These networked activities organized via social media are both a reaction to precarity and that's produced by the withering of institutions and a deepening of it. So I'm thinking about multi-level marketing, direct selling companies or MLMs that thrive on social media. Retail investing is exemplified by the 2021 GameStop rally. Work in the pyramid-shaped attention economy through platforms, ranging from OnlyFans to Substack. The proliferation of certification courses from yoga teachers to life coaches, drop shipping, growth hacking, and other forms of passive income generation. So much of this sits in what is literally called the hustle economy, where everyone is reminded to respect the hustle of the next person, to always try to out-hustle them, but accept when they themselves have been out-hustled. And of course, this isn't new, right? Like I do try to, I was trained well and I try to make an effort to always historicize the work that I'm doing. So I just want to, touch briefly on, the Herman Melville's 1857 novel, The Confidence Man, which is perhaps the foundational text for understanding scams in modernity. And in it, he offers it's a weird novel. It's very boring, but interesting if you can kind of get into the flow. It's just a series of confusing conversations between characters aboard a steamboat that's traveling down the Mississippi River, all of whom you figure out are trying to scam each other. There's folks who would be like the cast of characters would be recognizable to anyone who's been on Facebook lately, right? There's like a snake oil salesman. There's someone who's trying to do fraudulent labor, fraudulently trying to hire young people to go work out west. There's a fraudulent preacher. There's fraudulent widows and orphans. And ultimately, it's unclear to whom the confidence man of the title refers. Aboard the steamboat Fidel, everything is blurred. Conversation and commerce, commerce and con artist and chump. The novel satirizes the idea that scams are an aberration within the market economy, as well as the idea that there's one singular scammer, rather than, in today's term of art, or my term of art, I guess, a network of scammers whose interactions constitute that economy. And it was intended to be a satire of commercial life in America, written at a moment, much like now, when commercialization and its shadowy other scams were a key public concern. So a historian named Jonathan Levy writes, asks the question of this novel, or argues that the novel is asking the question, how was it possible to distinguish fact from fiction, general entrepreneurial ingenuity from well-disguised fraud, and what kind of moral universe were Americans living in if they had to walk around all day asking themselves such questions? But Levy continues and argues that the novel is ambivalent, kind of ambiguous. So he suggests that the novel argues that it's better to take the leap, to trust the confidence man, including our own inner confidence man, because anyone who hoards his confidence, refusing to trust others, is isolated and miserable. And that he suggests that Melville saw retreat from commercial society as miserly in a moral sense, and that to be willing to enter into scamful relations had become a precondition for social life itself. So on this, as on Melville's allegorical steamboat, scamminess may just be the terms of participation in the digital economy. And even though I'm the one via Levy that's kind of making that argument, I still find it very unsatisfying, right? Especially when we consider the kind of intersectional racialized, gendered power politics at play as we kind of fling ourselves into the new scam world. Okay, Florida, the one you've been waiting for. I've begun to think that there are perhaps deeper autobiographical roots to my interest in scams. So I grew up in Miami, Florida in the 1980s and 90s, and I spent my entire childhood trying to run away from my chaotic upbringing in Florida. And I consider getting out of the swamp one of my greatest achievements. But now I find myself drawn back for the very same reasons that drove me away. Florida is quite literally, like not a metaphor, a land terraformed by scams. The security regulations, notably the Howey tests that are used to regulate crypto and other unlicensed securities, were developed in response to Florida swampland scams in the first part of the 20th century. Florida was the crypto of its era, and it was the future, and it was mostly a scam future. Florida was also the infrastructure works of the future, and that too was mostly a scam. So, and to kind of illustrate this, I grew up near the terminus of Dixie Highway, which is a highway that was built to connect the Midwest to Miami, as literally a part of an effort to scam the federal government and to create a corridor to sell scams. And of course, history tells us that the Florida land boom scam went bust in the 1928 hurricane, which devastated Miami. But of course it didn't. Like, it went bust for a minute, but but we know that these weeds that are used to kind of shore up the terraforming of swampland scams are resilient, especially to hurricanes. Dixie Highway, right, that scam highway building project and highway of scams still exists. And I know because it now has 10 lanes in each direction, and I could hear it from my bedroom at night. Just because all was revealed to be a scam doesn't mean it goes away. Life in Florida when I was a kid was still marked by the experimental, the entrepreneurial, the scammy, right? Everyone, I'm not kidding when I say that everyone's parents I knew sold vitamins, or smuggled drugs, or sold timeshares, or scam modeling contracts, or ran a church or a cult, or lawyers to those who did, right? Like, everybody had a hustle. And even if they had a real job, they had a side hustle. And it kind of feels to me like the Florida of my childhood, which then felt like the edge of civilization, has kind of gone mainstream. And like the two kind of modalities of scam, like diagonal in this American geography, like Silicon Valley in the Northwest and Florida in the Northeast, are kind of converging and metastasizing onto the rest of the country, and kind of closing in on the rest of the world. And I'm really trying to think through this sort of like osmotic threshold wherein scam reality just becomes reality, right? Like, even if the promised future doesn't come to be, some future inevitably does. What kind of future happens in the aftermath of scams? How do you keep on living in Florida? How do you keep on living on the internet? And so this kind of place I'm really trying to wrestle with, the kind of key question I have now is like, how do you keep living in futures that were never meant to exist because they were supposed to be scams? And thank you.
Yeah, so I haven't been here while we've had this new system with the microphone. So is there a mic that goes around the room now? Oh, Oliver's got it. And Oliver just turned it on.
Did it work?
Thank you, that was great. We're gonna look for hands around the room, and then I'll also keep an eye on Zoom here, folks. So Andrew's got a question.
Hi, I'm Andrew Rosenthal, first year master's student. So I used to be on a research team before coming here, and we focused a lot on energy rights and energy vulnerability. And towards the end of the project, something that we started on that we never really made that much progress on was a paper on energy scams. Door-to-door salesmen, people saying, oh, we can reduce your energy bills, we're with your pretending to be your power company. And I'm curious if you have any familiarity with those kinds of scams, or if not, maybe door-to-door scams and how those might differ from electronic scams, and how those door-to-door scams might have adapted or changed based on the current landscape of digital scams.
Yeah, I mean, I know, I don't know that much about them, and I would love to hear more about them. So maybe we can have a follow-up conversation.
Sure.
What I will say about door-to-door scams is that door-to-door scams are often network scams in the sense that they are multi-level. So you're ringing doorbells trying to sell. Maybe the person who answers will be a person who will buy your like energy scam, or maybe the person who answers the door is a person who would like to themselves begin selling energy scams and going door to door. And this is like particularly pernicious in things like selling magazine scams, which really prey on young people who have been like kicked out of their house or otherwise really vulnerable, or like the Cutco knife scam, which is like a lot of college students kind of get into. And so those two have this kind of network formation where it's like, yeah, I'm trying to sell you a product, but I'm also trying to recruit you to join me in selling these products. So that's kind of like this kind of network scam thing has been around for a while. I know that there are energy scams in crypto as well. Like a lot of these ICOs were trying to build blockchain-based systems to monitor, regulate, create better climate conditions. Best case scenario, they just didn't exist. Worst case scenario, they added to climate. They added to climate change. I would love to talk more with you about that, though.
Yeah, sure. We can exchange contact info after.
Great.
You'd like.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, go ahead and pass it down to Fabian.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So I'm Fabian Prieto. I'm an assistant professor here at the STS department, and I have two questions. One is about, you mentioned this kind of switch from like traditional to platform, and you're focusing on platform, but I want to hear more about, the presence still of traditional forms of scam, like those that are telephone also, because they are still working. And this kind of thing that you're saying that the increasing surveillance is in these others, but these others are still affecting people, particularly older people, and also in a very racialized way in the United States, like black people getting scammed with Social Security and so on. So something is about like, okay, what happens with these other forms that still exist? Are they still like being surveilled, or these are okay? This is going to be like that. And also, I enjoyed your final kind of connection with Miami, also because you start with Jamaica and the Caribbean. So I wonder how this kind of like constitution of Florida as a scam city is not only the product of like people moving from the north into there, but also in this kind of connection of people trading. I mean, the Caribbean has a lot of like these islands, like British Virgin, that are like a paradise for fiscal issues. Like so it's a very complex thing that, again, you are saying there is a strength there that is now present in how this city is also like in existing as well. So those are the two things that maybe I want to hear more about.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the first sense, there's a little bit of disjoint thing in the presentation where the first part is really talking about how scams shape infrastructure and how this like scam prevention drives so many choices that then have these knock-on effects that wind up not preventing that many scams, but also kind of differentially, penalizing people or excluding them from the payment network. And so there's like kind of this like STS infrastructure study to be done, which I do partially in the book about, and I want to write more about because there's more to be said there, about how what payment industries think is a scam, and then all the different ways they try to prevent those scams wind up not preventing scams and like hurting people, usually the most vulnerable. And so it's this like what I called in the presentation like a paradox between like, most people don't want to be scammed, but also, most people want to not be surveilled and be able to use their money freely. It's a kind of an interesting media question as well, because, the dollar bill or whatever paper money is a really good payment technology, right? It's self-clearing, it's anti-surveillance, it doesn't really depend on other infrastructures, but it's not at all scam, it doesn't have any scam prevention built in, right? And so when we're trying to imagine like digital cash and trying to imagine like a future of payment systems that does have something like infrastructural justice, guiding its design, how do we think about offering some degree of scam prevention or fraud prevention and, protecting folks from being surveilled or being erroneously excluded. And I think that that's like an impossible charge, and it's really like an impasse for the design of payment systems, including like what I'm calling like a network scam. But then, so that's kind of one thing. That's kind of like the form and infrastructure of money and payments. And then the other piece, which is this like digital economy network scam, which I'm really interested in, it's kind of more my second project or my current project that are proliferating. Yeah, I mean, the whole Florida thing and the Caribbean, and you know, with offshore, as you mentioned, and with kind of the, I mean, it's like really the place, the Caribbean is a place where this boundary work gets done historically. Like this is okay scamming, this is not okay scamming, and it's been kind of an incubator for you know, new innovative commerce, some of which gets called a scam, some of which doesn't. I mean, starting with even like slavery as the kind of ultimate moral violation of in our kind of economic process. I'm still thinking about how to do that. I'm reading like various Caribbeanist anthropology and history. It doesn't escape notice to me that Bill Maurer, who I've worked with a ton and has shaped my work around payments, started off as a Caribbeanist. And yeah, my dad's from Bermuda, which is not in the Caribbean, but is this gonna be, he was like engaged in a lot of illicit trade. He was able to, my whole childhood, so that's something I'm, you know, thinking a lot about. I have a bunch of emails from folks who I met recently at a conference on Cuba who are sending me a bunch of like Cuba, Miami economic anthropology stuff that I would like to read. So I'd love to talk with you more about that. That's kind of like the actual literal place called Florida is something I'm like turning my gaze to and trying to understand. Yeah, thanks.
Phil Olson has a question online. Go for it, Phil.
Hey, thanks for this talk. It was really good. I'm in the SDS department as well. One thing I don't think you mentioned it, although I had to go to the bathroom at one point, so I might have missed it. But is gambling, right? So like online casinos, online lotteries, and sports books, right? And like speaking of capitalism out of place, right? Like, you know, offshore sports books and betting, right? I'm just wondering how you see that kind of, is that a part of what you're interested in studying, or like, I don't know, I just want to know your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I have a lot of, I teach classes, like graduate and undergraduate classes on kind of like money, media, and technology, or like kind of digital economies and cultures. And every semester I have students who do stuff on online sports books. And it's super fascinating to me. And I think it really is part of all of this, in terms of it's the way like platforms are intervening, in terms of like how it kind of operates a lot like retail investing. But the way it's kind of not, it doesn't fit neatly into like this like network scam thing that I'm working with right now, or trying to puzzle out, because it's not, the temporalities are so much faster, and there isn't like, hey, everybody hop on to my investment or hop on to my bet, and then we drive that price up, whether it's the way it happens with like GameStop or crypto or whatever. Instead, it's just kind of this like, yeah, I don't know. So it doesn't like neatly fit into like exactly what I'm trying to work on here, but it clearly is part of the same like world and like milieu, and the same people and the same platforms are involved in many of the same things. I think it's really interesting, and I can't claim any kind of expertise here, but I definitely think that it's going to be really interesting to see how online sports betting and like fantasy is like going to change like players' celebrity and players' opportunities, and like this kind of more individualistic kinds of betting rather than team-based betting. There's a lot there, and I don't know if I'll wind up writing about it, but I will love to read anything anybody else writes about it. And I hope
Thank
they
you.
cite me because it's like relevant. I hope I get there first.
Okay. Yeah. Go Tritiman, and then Daniel's got a question on at the end of the table.
Hi, my name is Tritiman, third year PhD student in the STS department. I have two questions. First question is what is scam? And the second is what is the difference between scam and corruption?
I mean, I don't really have a operationalized definition of like this is what a scam is, because I think it's like very contingent, and it means different things to different people at different times. And rather than like really parceling down and saying this is what scam means, I'm more like studying what gets called a scam and studying how what gets called a scam does boundary work that says these things are scams and these are not scams, and then how that categorization shifts over time, over contexts. And then in terms of corruption, I mean, I think, traditional definitions of corruption would describe it as kind of scams perpetrated by the powerful, right? Scams perpetrated by institutions. And so one of the, for me, what's most interesting about corruption is that like populist imaginaries of corruption are like circular because they drive people away from institutions and into kind of scammy institutions.
yeah.
And it's this kind of like Ouroboros of scamming. And that's not to say that those institutions are not corrupt, which is also not to say that these scams aren't scams. So I would the only contrast I would make between scams and corruption is that corruption arises from institutions, scams arise from the popular, that boundary work between the two is like equally interesting and fluid as these like, and are often about like these two spheres kind of corrupting each other.
I disagree, but we can.
Oh yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
good. He'll be there later. All right, Daniel, and then we'll go to Monami online.
Okay, thank you for a great talk. I try not to be the person who says it's all neoliberalism, but
Oh no.
I'm going to have to do that this time. But no, I'm thinking of two particular, well-defined, well-understood aspects of neoliberalism, and to see if you might see a connection. And thinking of neoliberalism as a state project, and so one is financial deregulation, and the other is sort of the cultural side of financial deregulation, which is reshaping citizens as financial subjects, who should think that my assets and my home should be financial assets, and I'm a sucker if I'm not reinvesting them and trying to. So what's the role? Maybe it's the question is what's the role of the state in defining and in constructing a scam economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like it's all. I too try to avoid being like it's all neoliberalism. Not because I don't think everything is not because I don't think it's neoliberalism, but I think that's kind of just settled knowledge. Like, and it's also is an easy way to kind of like smooth over other explanations that might be like better at getting at the texture of what's actually happening for people, and also, yeah, it's like if we just say everything's neoliberalism, what does that get us? And like, who cares? Like, cool. But I think what you're saying that, this is about, clearly financial deregulation is playing a role here, and this kind of like constant cat and mouse game between regulation, whether it's by states or by platforms, and like how those things, there's like, and the kind of things they seek to regulate, and then the regulatory capture that goes on. Like, scams are absolutely like co-constituted by any kind of regulatory body, and whatever infrastructure they're happening on, communicative infrastructure they're happening on, and the kind of social world in which they're touching down. And so I'm not really sure how to answer the question other than to say like, yeah, of course, and so I would say like, so where do we go from there? Like, what if, and again, like this is like early work, like I'm working on it, I'm writing it, I'm trying to figure it out, but like for someone for a reader like you, how would mapping that terrain help us better understand this? And that's a genuine question, not like I didn't do it because I didn't think it was interesting, but more just like do you think more of that needs to be laid out in order to kind of create the foundation for a more interesting project on scams? I don't know if you don't have to have a response, we can talk later. But you know what I mean? Like, I'm always thinking about how to build the house, and like what your question feels very compatible with my project, and I'm never sure like what's the foundation, what's the frame, what's the shingles of like the project itself. I don't know sorry if that was a very unsatisfying answer.
Daniel, do you want to come back, or I can go to Monami?
No.
Okay. All right, Monami.
Hi, Lana. Thank you so much for a really great talk. I didn't come because I've got a bit of a cold right now. Yeah, your talk was really quite amazing, and I learned a lot. And I think a lot about corruption and democracy, something that Tritiman brought up. But what I'm really interested in is the relationship, if you've thought about, well, so early on you said something about, the liberatory potential of scams, because now it's become thought of as scammy because it's reached the center of, whiteness in some ways, where it was very racialized as, scams happen on the fringes. But I was wondering about the relationship between scams and precarity, and perhaps racialization, in the sense of how, all of these sorts of platforms like GoFundMe or, all of these ways in which people help each other. And the trick there is to at least perform not being scammy, that you're genuinely. So personally, I'm on a meal train right now because I got hit by a bike 2 weeks ago, or hit by a car on my bike 2 weeks ago. And my face is looking better now. And I'm like, I feel bad that people are, still giving us food and things like that. And I feel like I have to perform injury in some way to deserve that. So just to say, like, if we're in a scam society and a lot of precarity requires the collective buying into that scam, in some way, how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like Levy's point with Melville, which is just like, if everything seems like a scam, and if you don't just sort of go for it anyway, then you're essentially depriving yourself of any kind of community, right? That there's a sort of like risk, and that maybe that risk of like any kind of social engagement being potentially a site of scam is heightened at different kind of historical, technological, regulatory, social kind of conjunctures, and we may be living in one now, and so too Melville may have identified one. Along the topic of kind of thinking about precarity, thinking about whiteness, thinking about like networks of online care, there's this really interesting podcast episode that I've been thinking a lot about, and I am still trying to wrap my brain around it, called Invisibilia, where they write about folks who, in kind of the height of COVID and kind of the height of the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, started doing what they call DIY reparations, which is essentially they asked white people to just give mutual, I mean, they didn't call it mutual aid because they didn't see it as a mutualist relationship, but to just give money to anonymous Venmo accounts that were held by Black people. And they were told, like, you don't get to ask the question about whether or not this is a scam. Like, you don't get to pick and choose and feel like a white savior and get all this emotional gratification. You don't get to like be critical about this. You don't get a choice. You just give, and you should keep giving till it hurts, like till it actually starts to feel like it impacts you. And there were activists who were involved in organizing this who felt very strongly that this was like the most liberatory way to kind of decenter whiteness and create like, economic reparations, aside from a kind of state-based project. And there were white people who felt like it was really their duty to do it. And this kind of like loss of control, loss of power, and like just like giving in to like the precarity of maybe being scammed and not really getting to have a say in it, I just think is like, from the perspective of the white people who are giving their money, it was so interesting and something I think about all the time because I can't quite characterize it. But like the message again and again was like, it might be a scam. Who cares? Like, you don't get to say. And I also think it's interesting that it's like enabled, it's only made possible because of new payment technologies like Venmo, where it's just kind of like, it allows you to have this sort of like message in a bottle of payments where, or like, I actually was, I don't know. Anyway, it's just the anonymity, the kind of disjuncture between payer and payee, and this kind of like deeply ambivalent, scam question there alongside the racial politics of it is super interesting. And like, that's something I hope to write about, but I haven't figured out how to yet. But I think it relates to your question.
Cool. I'm going to read a question here from Fernanda, and then we'll go to you, Jack, if that's all right. Yep. Okay, beautiful. Fernanda, one of the co-organizers of the seminar, writes, "Thank you for such a fascinating presentation. I'm curious to know if during your study of infrastructures of money and scam, you found out about the code underlying these digital infrastructures and which types of code they are. Is there any overlap between code underlying the scams and the digital money ecosystems?"
I don't know about it at the code level. I know more about it at the kind of operational level, but I haven't drilled down to the code level, other than I guess some of the kind of crypto code, which is not really related.
I mean, most of it's just basic internet protocols running this stuff, right?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's interesting is that it rides the rails of like I can tell you about like the systems, the rails that it rides. So it's like, it's not code, but there's like, it rides the rails of the ACH, the Automated Clearinghouse, which is a shared infrastructure run by the banks and by the Federal Reserve as like a utility for payments. So it's like very, very, very low cost and very, very slow. And I don't know what the code is, but it's like old and works, and and does not get messed up, but very clunky and slow, and you can't really do anything with it. And so, you can send money and receive money with it, but so almost all new platform payments want to use that system because that system is cheap. They don't want to go to the card network, and where is it? They don't want to go to the card network. They want to go, it doesn't matter. I was going to pull up my slide, but they because the card networks assess fees, card networks have chargebacks, card networks have all these other rules. This system is just get money, give money, make it really slow, but it works really well and it's really cheap. And platforms kind of simulate like same day ACH, which is like it looks like if I pay you with Venmo, it looks like you have the money already, but you don't really have the money. It's just a book transfer between my account and your account. And then some days later, if we decide to evacuate, if you decide to move your money out of your account to your bank account, you would use the ACH. Or if I choose to fund my account using the ACH, then that's how they get it. And in ACH, there's no chargebacks, right? So they are just like, they don't figure, they agree to not be the arbiter of that. It just kind of is what it is. And you can try to get your money back via your bank, but usually you don't. And so it's not code, but it sort of depends like which networks where and which networks get layered on top of each other and what the affordances of those networks are in this kind of payment stack. But then also the ability to kind of be interoperable and create interoperability with all of these systems and like try to, as a platform, take advantage of the cheapest while enforcing the rules of the most like arduous in order to kind of cover your ass as a platform and make the most money. and scale. So.
Good. Jack, shoot.
Yeah, hey there. Fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. I have an affinity for learning about scams, and I love all the podcasts that talk about them. So it was so fantastic to hear you talk. And I'm also glad. So I'm asking a question because you of the reparations situation that you brought up in response to Monami's question. Because I've been a political organizer for about 10 years now, and I was actually next to one of those schemes that ended really poorly and raised all these sort of ethical questions where sort of two groups of Black trans women in the community were fighting around the use of this money and some ethical abuses that it got tangled up with. And so I've seen it firsthand, and it's a really weird situation. And so it got me starting to think about the nature of trust within social movements and how scams operate within that space, especially given the sort of weird history of like co-optation of liberatory language and frameworks, infiltration, which has sort of created a need for trust and a really environmental, strong sort of environment for trust, but also one of constant vetting. And I'm really sort of curious, especially since you brought up the idea of scamming and liberatory potential, how some of these ideas interact with one another, like this idea of environments of trust and infiltration, social movements, and then the liberatory potential of scams. And that's just really vague, but I thought it was, I think it's just really interesting.
No, I agree. I think that's really interesting. And then, there's lots of thinking to be done there. And then, another question that's adjacent to the questions you brought up is, which social movements? So, on the right and in kind of white supremacist communities, there's a lot of grift. A lot. I was on a committee for a student who at UNC who did a project on political merch, and and it was really interesting, and she kept trying to find the right the MAGA political merch that was didn't have some kind of scam attached to it, and they were very, very capacious and learning from all the best scams, subscription scams and all these other things, and it was pretty bald-faced. Whereas this DIY reparations thing that, again, I haven't done research on it, it's just a podcast I listened to, was interesting because it was so, in contrast, was interesting because it was so focused on the this might be a scam, and you have to be okay with that, and there is none of that discourse in right-wing worlds. It's, I don't know, I think it would be there's a project to be done on political organizing and scams, and their discourses, their practices, and across the spectrum, for sure.
No, I appreciate that, and I think that it's something worth talking about more. I think that we tend to valorize left-wing social movements in a lot of ways, and I've seen after and I'm sure some of the other folks can testify to this too. There's a lot of scams. I've seen money being sent off for jail support that gets misappropriated, pretty egregious stuff. And I appreciate
thinking about historically. I remember when I was a PhD student at USC, I wound up spending a lot of time in a kind of quasi-ethnographic mode at Occupy LA. And I wound up writing a bit about Occupy because my advisor wrote about it. So, and then I was really interested when my kind of dissertation work was I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in alternative economic arrangements. So as part of Occupy, there were people who were trying to do alternative feminist solidarity economies, or local exchange networks, time banks, skill trading, all of these alternatives. And then there were people who were holding up signs that were end the Fed, and very aggressive anti-institutionalist, but in a very different way than the kind of feminist solidarity economies were. And then there were actual literal, there were so many scammers inside of Occupy, for real. And then there were, Bitcoin actually, some of the earliest kind of blockchain stuff. The Genesis block has like blockchain graffiti on it talking about like bank bailouts in the UK. So like this kind of 2007, 2008 moment, which I read a little bit in my book as like this like sort of like crucible from which all of this strange fintech arose, I think is also like a historical moment that's worth understanding for all of these things.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I got 2 quick questions online, and then we'll go to Cora first, and then Yen. Okay, so Yen was first, and then Cora. All right. What's that?
Well, we also have Christine, so we both
Well, we just negotiated something between us.
Oh, I didn't see your hand. Is it?
Pass me, but Yen has had the mic for a long time.
Okay, I just hold up your hand or like really get my attention. I'm sorry, I've been looking around, but apparently not enough. So the 2 quick questions are, Richard Hirsch just has a fun question that I feel like I can add to another, which is that do you answer your phone when it says potential scam? And then and he said, if so, what do you say? And then the other one is Phil, who talked earlier, asked a question earlier, just wants to build on Daniel's and ask if you think that one answer is like stronger federal regulation around scams. So why don't you?
So first one, I don't, but I do spend a lot of time looking at subreddits and YouTube channels of so-called scam baiters, who are people who do answer their phone and are actively trying to kind of scam the scammers. And there is a kind of interesting, also like there's a cognizance of what they're doing there, because they recognize that the person on the other side of the scam call is likely a poor person living in the global south who is trying to make money, you know? And so some of the research on call centers in general, so like there's a sociologist named Anish Anish who writes about, I mean, many people who write about call centers, but there's an interesting one about where are you if you're living in call center time, like geographically, like you're not in India, you're sort of in I don't know, like, I don't want to say space of flows, but a kind of space of flows that's like a nowhere temporal geographic arrangement. So like there is this like ambivalence in the scam baiting community of like, are they just being, can I say assholes? Are they just being assholes to some person who is more precarious than they are, or are they doing something liberatory, which again cycles back to kind of some of the questions of like precarity and whiteness and privilege and scams and liberation and what kind of acts are liberatory around scams and what aren't. But there's an interesting world of scam baiters that I don't bother answering. I just study the people who do. And then is the answer more federal regulation? I wish that it were kind of like part of me deep down wants to be like, I want to be a Warren Democrat. Like I want to believe it. But I think that I'm like trying to wrestle with the idea that like in this context, traditional notions of consumer protection fall flat. And that, you know, I'm thinking about something like GameStop, where, you know, I got asked by many reporters, like, why would young people throw away their money into what is obviously kind of a short-term scam, make these big YOLO bets with their money? Why won't they just be like rational and imagine, you know, take out and make investments that will pay off in 30 years?
Index funds.
Right, index funds, you know, 30-year mortgages, you know, pay your, you know, 401ks. And it's like, can you imagine 30 years from now? Like, if money is like a futuration, who do we ask to bet on a future that's going to happen and exist in 30 years, and to stake everything on these like temporal scales where we really don't know, with regard to climate change, with regard to political unrest, with regard to kind of the change of everything, that what worked for like my parents, or not my specific parents, but other people's parents, is going to pay off for my children or or my students. And like, I think it's reasonable for people to feel, especially young people, to feel like attempts at consumer protection and federal regulation are paternalistic and ineffective at best.
So I'm sorry I missed hands earlier, folks. Can we collect a couple at a time? So Yen, can you ask your question, then we'll go to Christine.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm Yan, third-year PhD student, and I really enjoy your speech. I only have one quick question. Is because we kind of like go through so many different kind of scan. I'm always wondering about the life cycle of the scans. So, since you mentioned about network scan, because sometimes we will just assume that scan is kind of like a YOLO project, or you just rob money from some people and then you go and then you just enjoy your money and then that's all. But sometimes because you mentioned about network scam, so can this network of scam become a network of business? Just like this kind of door-to-door scan, they can also become a new form of business, and then later they might become a legalized company, and then later they might maybe later they don't need to do any kind of scam. They can just like being a company, maybe a purchasing or buying agent, and provide very good customer service, like Amway, because Amway used to do a lot of. Sorry about that. I'm sorry about that, offending any people here.
No.
Yeah, but also you can also see some kind of online casinos gambling industry. They might be part of. They might be like scam, or they might be dangling in the gray area. But they really want to legalize themselves. And then later And then later there's a pandemic strike, and then now they cannot run their gambling or online gaming company business anymore. Then they turn to scams because they still got infrastructure, they still got their call center, they still got all these kind of online platform they can use. So they tend to online scam from online gambling to online scams.
All right, so we got life cycle of scams, and then Christine.
So first I have a podcast recommendation for you to complement the one you're wrestling with, which is a podcast called Other People's Pockets. And there's an interview with a Black financial dominatrix who's talking about this space that you
I actually got interviewed for the podcast I mentioned, and I brought up financial dominatrixes, and I brought up like this anonymity almost, because it felt to me like this whole thing felt like it was actually very gratifying to the white donors. Like, you don't get to decide, actually felt like they sort of enjoyed that.
I mean, this is, and she's got a panel.
But they didn't put me in because they felt, the podcasters did not like that.
They didn't want to go there.
Want to go there. And I also called it a financial glory hole, which they were like, that is well going on our podcast. But anyway,
this is totally your space. She's got a panel that says reparations. And I mean, like, it's very explicit. But anyway, she's thinking it in conversation with what you were saying you were talking about. And then I just wanted to ask you a little bit about just the materiality of all of this. I guess just you made a comment, so you were talking about one of the crypto scams, and you said, people might be left with a coin or a shattered dream. And I was like, whoa, that's a big range. Like, right. And so I just was thinking a lot about like whether you think about or other folks that you recommend or read are kind of talking and thinking about like what's material in all of this, because it's so immaterial. So yeah, that's all.
Do you want to stack more and then, or
well, sure?
Yeah.
Well, I don't go.
Wait.
I didn't need to jump in and talk about dominatrix, talk about glory holes.
Please continue.
That was good. That was the right move.
I think you've actually kind of already answered the question that I was trying to form around reparations and then the MAGA being full of scam and the ways that those spaces, like them having to be up front, is about signaling privilege, right? And for the MAGA donors, they don't have to for the exact same reason, right? And in fact, they both probably enjoy doing this for
Yeah.
All right, you got a lot there. Go for it.
Okay, so life cycle of scams, I think there's absolutely this kind of like back and forth, like the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate is totally fluid, both in terms of like the categorization work that happens, but also across time, and like organizations and people move in and out of categories, and the categories change. And the call centers that Jovan Scott Lewis writes about do exactly that. Like, they are part of this like development project, that wherein, Jamaica borrows a bunch of money to build call centers, and then they build the call centers, and then some things change in the industry, and they're not as cheap as other places. The call centers are not being used. People are trained. Young people are literally trained to talk to old Americans and get money from them. legitimately, the infrastructure's there, which is again like a kind of materiality component. The infrastructure meaning like the fiber optic, the office buildings, the headphones, all that stuff, and then that kind of moves back and forth between like legitimate work and illegitimate work, and then people do most of these call centers actually scam call centers are almost always doing both, like all over the world. Like they're both doing scams and doing like non-scams, and sometimes the people operating it don't really know whether what they're doing is a scam or not, like the actual person on the phone, the worker. Like it's just a call and a script, and the people who are really good at it tend to know what they're doing. But and so, yeah, I mean, I think that the life cycle is interesting, but it's not just a life cycle. There's many kind of temporal rivulets at play, and then also categorizations change too. Materiality of crypto stuff, there's a lot that has been kind of written to kind of theorize this, and like, I'll have to think about some good recommendations for you, but
oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
There's a lot. I just don't know it. So
No,
yeah,
I mean,
I'm curious how it fits into how and if it's fitting into the conversation or shaping the conversation when people talk about stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few. My moves in that have been not that interesting, I think, but I think important kind of to go back to like what's table stakes and what's kind of like what's the structure, what's the sticks, what's the frame of the house, of just like we act like Bitcoin is like ethereal, but it's not. It's literally, much like the cloud. It's actual data centers and et cetera. And then some of the more interesting stuff that I don't do, but I think is interesting, is thinking more about like materialities of value vis-a-vis like other older money forms like gold or precious metals, and how those things made claims on materiality that Bitcoin kind of tries to borrow from and act on, even as it's like making claims about being kind of ethereal. So there's stuff. I mean, I'll be happy to send it to you. Yeah.
And then Cora, did you already handle that? That was already done.
Okay.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah. No, but I agree. I 100% agree. And there's obviously, and I think this conversation has surfaced that's like a really good vein of thinking and research to be done.
Well, awesome. That was so good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was really fun. Cool.
Thank you. That was good. And thank you, Athenaeum crew, for your hard work.
Yes. All right. I have to go to the bathroom.
Oh, yeah. Do you know where it is?
No.
Yeah, let's take you.
Wow.